So good morning, my name is Magnus Hagander. I work for a company called Red Pill Linpro. We're an open source services and consultancy business in Scandinavia. And I'm here from Stockholm in Sweden myself, where I work, basically I lead up our database efforts. The company does a whole bunch of other open source things, but I focus around Postgres. But more importantly, as to why we are here now is in the Postgres community. I'm one of the core team members, along with 4 other people, also Peter, who will be giving a keynote later today, who is also here, and a bunch of other people. I'm one of the committers who supposedly writes code for the server. Maybe not as much as I'd like to, but at least some of it. And in particular, as Marco mentioned, I'm serving as the president of the board for PostgreSQL Europe, the European sort of coordinating non-profit entity that coordinates community activities across Europe. And as, well, I think the schedule just said keynote, but at least my talk says the Postgres community. So I'm here today to talk to you about the Postgres community and sort of a few of the things that set us apart, and a few of the things where we work different, and a few of the things where you need to do things and stuff like that. So let's start talking about Postgres. Right? Does anyone not know what Postgres is? Okay, good. You're all in the right room. You're not supposed to be at some other event here. That's all good. Right? We all know that it's the world's most advanced open source database. You've all seen this slogan before. But where does that actually come from? Like, what do we mean by that? Where does it go? Well, we get the part where it says the world's most advanced, like it's all the cool features. But what does it actually mean today to be an open source database? This used to be a much more clear distinction previously, and then it has become a lot more muddled when you look at the whole market. There are a lot of projects, there are a lot of products that call themselves open source, and they may very well be open source. Right now we have a general problem with a number of products who call themselves open source who aren't actually open source. But it's also the fact that you can have an open source product and still be very different from Postgres. And there are a couple of sort of standard models. If we look at the database market in general, most of the competition does something that's different from Postgres. There's very few other databases. In fact, there's very few projects at all in the open source space that works like Postgres. Of course, the obvious competitors that we have in the database space are, the classical company-owned proprietary database. Right? It's still by far the biggest part, right? You've got products like Oracle, like Microsoft, DB2, Ingress, or at least the older Ingress. Informix is the one I was thinking of. Everybody knows of those, right? And then we have the idea of company-sponsored open source, which is where we find things like MySQL and MariaDB, where we find products like MongoDB. And these are closer to Postgres, but they're not working the same way as we do in Postgres. Now again, the company-owned proprietary, everybody knows and everybody understands how this works, right? We're used to this. One company owns the product, one company employs all the developers. Okay, maybe they'll bring in some consultants to do some work, but it's all under the control of the one entity. One company provides all the support for the product. Sometimes they work through partners, so that you may have a third-party company that sells you support on your Oracle or your Microsoft installation. But in the end, everything bubbles up to this one entity. And your product is typically licensed for individual use. You can get big things like, you get a massive site license of your database. You can run as much as you want, but it's still only within your own company. And sometimes it's only within the same country and things like that. This is stuff we're used to, right? And then we have the part where we talk about the company-sponsored open source, where the product is licensed under an open source license, such as the BSD or MIT licenses, or the GPL license, or any of these licenses that are approved by the open source initiative, and therefore they're allowed to call themselves open source. This is where we're seeing some things in the market now, where we have people who are pushing what they call open source licenses that are not approved by the Open Source Institute, who are the ones who define what is open source. So there's some things here, but if we look at the traditional database world of MySQL and MariaDB, for example, these are good examples here where the product is open source, but it is controlled by one company. Right? It used to be MySQL AB, then it became Sun, and then it became Oracle, and then it forked, and now we have Oracle and MariaDB. But they're controlled by different commercial companies, but they're both controlled by one entity. And this one entity controls what gets done and what gets in, right? They're doing decently. I mean, I'll certainly file up with the ones who are saying that Oracle is actually taking pretty good care of MySQL. But it's still their decision. They're the ones who create this dual license. They're the ones who can control and drive things. One company employs most of the developers. It doesn't employ all of them. There are plenty of outside contributors to most of these products. But the majority of the development happens under the control of one company. But given that the source that we get is open source, we get a market for third parties who can deliver full high-level support without being under the control of this one entity. Because as a support-giving company, you can read the source and you can fix the source if the customer has a problem. So we've decoupled it a little bit. The development is, oops, sorry, that's called a screensaver. The development is still controlled by one side, but the code is available. And of course, what we've seen, the traditional way to monetize on this is by combining these two, right? Again, the perfect example, since we are now in a database setting, is MySQL, where they had an open source version and a proprietary version. And on the proprietary version, they make money, and the open source version is also available for those who don't want the special features or want the extra support and things like that. And this is sort of based on the idea that one company retains the full support, right? If you want to sell a proprietary version and an open source version, and make an open source version available to your product, you have to own everything, right? Because only the one entity can produce the commercial proprietary version. Then anybody else can take the open source version and do something with it. But there is the one controlling entity who has a lot more power in this equation than anybody else. Which means in the end, if you purchase the proprietary version of this product, regardless of which product it is, you've just purchased another proprietary database. And we have such things in the Postgres ecosystem as well, where people build proprietary versions of Postgres. But they're different products, and they're different companies building different proprietary versions, because that's what the Postgres license allows. But the core product is not affected by this. Because as you say, Postgres is none of the above. Right? There is no super controlling entity. It certainly isn't proprietary. I'm sure you've all figured that out, that it is an open thing. And what some would say it's a pure open source. I like to differ between open source products, like say MySQL, and open source projects, like Postgres, where open source is not just a means of distribution, but it's the actual underlying model of the entire project. That means that no company owns Postgres. And no company controls what happens in the next version of Postgres. Nobody makes that decision. And many different companies employ the majority of the developers. There are some big players in the Postgres community who employ a large number of contributors, and there are many small players who employ a fewer number of contributors. But there is no controlling entity. Many different companies provide support to Postgres. Right? Some of them are sponsors here, some of them are just present in the community all the time, and they all do it on equal terms. They just have to compete. Someone did something and it wasn't me. Yes! And the point is, like, anyone can do it. You compete on simply delivering better support. And if you start doing a bad job, somebody else can just step in and deliver a better support. Same thing for development side. So it doesn't mean that Postgres isn't built by companies. It just means that there are many companies that together own the product. And there are many companies that together control the product, sort of regardless of where they come from. And what it really comes down to, and this is the part where in a lot of cases it really makes a difference. So it's really, a lot of it is really about the fact that it's many persons that own the product. It's not companies. And it's many persons that control the product. It's not the companies. And this is at the core of saying this is what community is, right? Community is about the many different persons working together to build this product, regardless of which company they work for. They may work for a different company tomorrow and still contribute exactly the same way to the greater part, which is the community that owns and runs everything. But that of course brings up the other question, who owns Postgres? Who actually owns Postgres? And it's a very simple answer. No one. Or everyone, depending on how you want to define it. Nobody actually owns Postgres. Now there are a number of entities involved, because you also have to ask yourself when you say who owns Postgres, well, what do you mean by Postgres? Because there are many things that are Postgres. There is the name itself, there is the code base, there is, I don't know, the servers that run the website, there's all sorts of things that people could own. And there are a couple of entities that are important to recognize here. We have something called the PostgreSQL Community Association of Canada. Who has ever heard of that one? Okay, at least one person who I think is a board member of it, and one more. So that's pretty much it. So basically, this is intentional. Like, you're not supposed to have to care about these people, and they're not really doing anything. But they are a registered non-profit organization that is registered in Canada. The reason it's in Canada is purely historical, and it doesn't actually matter that much. But what it does is this organization owns the name Postgres. It owns the trademark on the name Postgres. And it owns all of our domain names, things like that. Because domain names actually have to have an owner. You can't register a domain if you don't say who owns it. And you can't register a trademark without having somebody own it. Doing that in our own association is one way. You will see some other smaller projects who, for example, use what's it called, the Software Freedom Conservancy, I think, to just join that and have them own legal and take legal ownership of things. But the important part is the PGCAC is not involved in building Postgres in any way. It's not involved in supporting Postgres in any way. It is just a holder of these names. And then we have this entity called the Postgres Global Development Group, which is, if you've ever looked at the Postgres source code, for example, this is the one that holds the copyright to the Postgres source code. And it doesn't exist. I mean, it exists, but this is not a legally defined this is not a legal entity. There's no it's not registered anywhere, it just exists. And interestingly enough, in talk to lawyers around licensing and things, they actually really like this idea. Because sometimes if it had existed, then potentially somebody could take it over, somebody could purchase it, do things like that. That's impossible because it doesn't actually exist. And what it constitutes of, the definition is sort of everybody who has ever contributed anything to Postgres is a member of the Postgres Global Development Group. So it's really hard to even define who it is. Which means that it's just this sort of open entity that owns, it's public code, right? But it's public code that also works in jurisdictions where there is no such thing as public code, because they exist in a fair number of places. There is this term called public domain code, but that doesn't actually legally work in a lot of countries. You have to have an owner. Well, we have this owner, we just can't really explain who they are. And then of course, being where we are, we have Postgres Europe, which is the European non-profit representing Postgres. And Postgres Europe also doesn't have anything to do with the development of Postgres, and it doesn't have anything to do with providing support for Postgres, but it coordinates advocacy efforts. Right? It coordinates some marketing things, it organizes a bunch of conferences around Europe. Not all of them. This one, for example, is not organized by Postgres Europe. We're friendly competitors, we work together. We're not competitors, sorry. We're corporations, we work together. But the IT Pug is running this as an autonomous event. Whereas we have some other small events around Europe that are run by Postgres Europe. And then we have our big events like the Postgres Conference Europe that is run entirely by it. But it establishes guidelines for how we want things to behave around Europe or organizations to behave. And it assists. It's around to help anyone who wants to do anything advocacy related in Europe. And there are similar organizations in other parts of the world that all work sort of with distinct portions of what needs to get done and both completely independently and also always together. So the community owns everything, right? So then who owns the community? Right? How else would it work? And of course, the answer again, who runs the community? Is you get to who owns the community, right? You can't own people. At least in most of the world, that's illegal. But you can control what they do, and you can run this thing, right? And of course, the answer again is nobody actually runs the community. Like, how would you do that? You have thousands of people, all employed by different organizations, working in different places around the world, and what you're going to tell them what to do? It works, like your employer can tell you what to do because they give you money, right? It's called a salary. And if you don't like it, then you can quit and go somewhere else, and that's how the market works. But the Postgres community doesn't pay anyone. So the Postgres community can't tell anyone what to do. We can sort of give guidelines to say, hey, we would really like it if someone did this. But if nobody wants to do it, it doesn't get done. And a lot of it really comes down to, the concept of herding cats. Like, how do you get everybody to run in the same direction? And the answer is you don't. It's impossible. Instead, you let this sort of slightly organized chaos take the product forward instead of trying to control it. And it turns out over the year that has actually worked pretty well. Now, there are things that gets frustrating about it when you see, somebody comes year after year to somewhere and say, well, this feature is really important. Why can't we build that? People who write the documentation. At least as important as writing the code. People are answering emails on the mailing lists or answering, questions on Stack Overflow or in any of these forums, answering on IRC or on Slack, providing coffee to the developers. I mean, this is important. We're in Italy, you know that. I don't have to tell you that. All of these are important parts of the community. And all of these are equally sort of unstructured and sort of self-feeding mini ecosystems, if you will. But the point is, it's all made up of the people. They may or may not represent a company. When Postgres started out, well, obviously when it completely started out, it was at Berkeley University, it was a university project. But soon after that, when it left Berkeley, nobody was really paid to work on it, right? This was all about the people who were doing this, not representing a company. If we look at Postgres today, a lot of the work is done by people representing a company. But their work in the community, or their participation in the community, is as people, not as companies. Like a company can't really be part of a community. A company employee can be part of the community. A company can be supportive of the community by, for example, letting their own employees use work time to contribute to Postgres. But it's made up of all these people, regardless of what they do, and in particular also regardless of where they're from. It's a global community. Postgres doesn't care. We have people working on it. We're like obviously the biggest areas are going to be North America and Europe. Also a lot of people in Asia. We are pretty weak in Africa so far, but we certainly have people in Africa who do Postgres. And that is not just use Postgres, but work actively within the community. We've got a large number of people in South America. I don't think we have anyone in Antarctica, but that may be the only continent where we don't. That's not to say that Postgres isn't necessarily used there, but we don't have contributors in Antarctica. But the community doesn't care where you're from, geographically or company-wise. Now we do have some defined rules. I said there's all this lack of structure, right? There's all this everybody does whatever they want kind of thing. But there are some roles, right? You can't just go do whatever you want. There are a few roles within the community. For example, as I mentioned in my opening slide, we have the core team, of which I'm one of the members. The core team is in charge of things like defining project policies. Now, it's not supposed to make them up out of thin air. We talk about it on the mailing list, just like we do with code. But at some point, you have to make the decision saying, okay, this is the policy that we're going to use. And it's the core team's responsibility to say, okay, we're done, here's what we're going to do. It manages permissions, so any other roles that needs to be handed out. the core team hands out. Sort of, these are trusted developers that get higher level access. These are the people that will run our infrastructure and therefore have access to lots of data. All of those things. Core team is responsible primarily for handling disciplinary issues. Luckily in Postgres we don't have a lot of those. We haven't traditionally, at least. You never know, you have to be careful, it might happen. Traditionally, the core team was also in charge of all release coordination. This has now mostly been decentralized. It's now separate teams that consist of more people and more developers who control the whole, oh, we're done, we're ready for release kind of part. We have release teams. We have a release management team for every release that sort of manages one release, things like that. So we have a bunch of those things. And in theory, the core team also makes the decision when there is no consensus. Now, the Postgres way is usually if there is no consensus, we just keep bike shedding and talking about it for years and years and years, and then we eventually come to a decision. In theory, the core is supposed to overrule those. I think the last time they did that was when they decided not to rename the project, and that we're still going to be PostgreSQL. We're not going to change the name to Postgres. We're just going to allow people to say Postgres. Like, that also doesn't happen all that often. It's really the first 3 points that are most of what the core team does. And the core team of Postgres is pretty small. It's 5 people. It used to be 6 until, what is it, about a year ago, or a year and a half, when Josh Berkus resigned from the core team because he doesn't work with Postgres anymore. This is a self-elected group. So basically the core team appoints their own replacements so as to ensure the continuity of the project spirit and things like that, which means it can't be taken over. That's one of the big advantages of this model, that it can't be taken over by a corporate entity. There are disadvantages to this model, which is that the rest of the community doesn't really have a formal say in who goes on there. It represents multiple companies. There is an informal or formal, I don't remember which one, rule that says no company can have more than 2 people on the core team, because then one company would be in majority and could start making decisions, but that's simply not allowed. Right now there is one company that has 2 people on the core team. It's Enterprise DB has 2 people. Second Quadrant has 1. Red Pill Impro, me, has 1. Where's the last one? Oh, Crunchy Data has 1. And the whole idea is to keep this diverse, to make sure that no entity can take over the project. And that's sort of the overall umbrella of the organization. Then we have our team of committers. Though in theory today we use Git, right? And in Postgres, the way that we use Git, what we call committers are really the people who have access to push code to the core Postgres repository. Because in Git, everyone can commit wherever they want in your local branch, and nobody else can see it. That doesn't help you. So it should really be like pushers today, but I don't think we're going to rename them to, Postgres pushers. I think that'll be, I don't know. It's not great, so let's not do that. But these are sort of the gatekeepers to the code itself. Write access to the code repository. Everyone can read the code repository, obviously. So the committers are the ones who kind of write the code. They write code, but in particular, they review code and they maintain code. Because any one of you can write code and contribute it to Postgres. And if it's good, it will get accepted, it will get reviewed, it will get committed, but then someone has to maintain all the code that's already in Postgres. And that's really the big burden that falls on the committers, isn't the initial commit of code. It's ownership and maintenance of this code over many, many years. The committers are approximately 25. I think there's a little bit more than 25 right now, but there's also a couple who are almost completely inactive. So somewhere in the order of 25, so 5 times as many as we have on the core team. We normally add new committers on a yearly basis. And mostly only remove committers if they've stopped working on Postgres, which for some reason happens. People move on in life. I don't see why, but clearly they do. And the thing about committers is it requires a long-term commitment. And it's something that we award to people, not to companies. And that's a question that I get it less now than I used to, but I still get it a fair amount, which is, a new company starts pushing in some money and investing in Postgres, hiring a bunch of people, building up an organization, and then they say, okay, so when do we get our first committer? And the answer to that is, first of all, as a company, you don't ever get your committer. Your employee might become a committer, but that takes years of involvement and shown of like a long-term interest and a long-term commitment to the project from the person. The reason for that is, of course, that, again, committers is much more about maintaining things than about building new things. Of course, they also build new things, because to be honest, that's the fun part. Right? Who'd want to be a committer if all you ever got to do was maintain other people's code? It would not be as fun. But somebody has to maintain it, and that comes as part of the deal with being one of the committers. So yeah, it's not, this as well is not a position that you can sort of buy your way into. It's about the long-term thing. It has upsides and it has downsides. One of the biggest problems we have in Postgres is getting more of these, because we don't just want to add them. We want to make sure that we add people who will be around for the long term and who will ensure the high quality standards of code that we have. And then, of course, we have our local NPOs, or non-profit organizations, around in different areas. We have regional NPOs, we call them. We have Postgres Europe, we have Postgres US, we have the Japanese Postgres user group. They're all over the world. These are the three biggest ones. Other than this, we also have this Canadian association, but they're not involved with Postgres in Canada, really. They don't have any activity, they just are holders. And these, unlike all these other things, Postgres committers, Postgres core, the Postgres global development group, these are all unregistered organizations, right? They're just virtual. But these NPOs exist and are registered. For example, Postgres Europe is registered in France. The reason we ended up in France was just when we started it, we had people who had done it before in France, and they knew how to file the paperwork, so we did it in France. It doesn't really matter, it's in Europe, right? The US one is obviously registered in the United States of America, JPUG in Japan, etc. They have formal boards of directors, they have formal elections, they have all sorts of things that are usually required by the local governments. If you want to be a non-profit, a registered non-profit in France, there are certain rules you have to follow. So these are the kind of formal organizations. These are the organizations, they work hard on setting up statutes and things to make it impossible to get exposed to a takeover. But these could, in theory, be exposed to like a hostile takeover from somebody. It's possible here because there is something to take over. And most of that is simply because there has to be. Now, hopefully that's not going to happen. But it's something that those of us who work in them always have to consider. For example, we have adjusted the statutes of Postgres Europe to put in this rule about no company gaining majority of the board. We didn't originally have that because nobody even thought of that. But as things have grown, it's something that we've started to consider more. That these are things that could actually happen. Because a lot of things have happened with the community across time, right? This started out, when Postgres started out, it was very different from what it is now, even if we're ignoring the university times. And even when I got started in Postgres, which is starting to be a long time ago now, but it was significantly after Postgres left the university, it's not the same. Very large portions of what it has changed. So for example, the core team, originally when Postgres left Berkeley, being on core implied that you were also a committer. Because these were basically the people who wrote Postgres, right? There's no actual relation with that anymore. There's only 4 out of the 5 people on core who are committers, and a year ago, or 1.5 or what it was only 4 out of 6. Because if you think back to the slide where I said this is what core does, none of that actually has to do with writing code. Core is more of project management. You don't have to be a committer there. But originally, core was like everyone. That was everybody who was there. It used to be that the Postgres committers did 99% of all the development. Because it was one of those, oh, you have a patch, well, here's your commit bit, go ahead. It's not how it works anymore. Today, a committer's job is much more focused on reviewing code that comes in from the outside. Of course, you also get to build your own code, but the focus has shifted. A lot more of it comes into cleanup and adjusting other people's ideas and other people's code and maintaining the quality and the design of the code and make sure that things work. It's less about writing things yourself. And this, of course, comes with the community just growing, right? You can't have today, we can't have I don't know, 20,000 person core team. Like, that doesn't work. It doesn't work well with the definition of core, right? Whereas the community is growing. We're adding more people all the time. We're adding a lot of developers. We're certainly adding a lot of users. And we're adding people in all these other roles. Coffee makers. Conference makers, maybe more of that, and all sorts of things. And if you look at it, I mean, one point, I'd just like the chances to bring this up. This used to be Postgres, right? This is, as far as I know, the first time, it's a picture from the first time that the entire core team met at once. Yeah, there's what, 6 of them? And at the time, those were basically all the Postgres developers. Not entirely true, there were a couple more, but these were the main parts of it. And a couple of those are still around. I mean, they're all still around, but all of them don't work with Postgres. And they're not all on the core team. So it started there at some point. And back in that time, no one was actually employed to work on Postgres. Worldwide, nobody was employed to work on Postgres. All the contributors were users. Either these were people who were doing it for fun, or they were people who were using Postgres or who wanted to use Postgres, but they couldn't because it wasn't good enough, so they worked on fixing that. But there were no companies that would sell you services on Postgres. It just didn't exist. And a lot of the work was done in the free time. Now, if you look through time, I don't actually remember. Does anyone, I'll just look at you. Peter, you're in the back. Do you remember when this photo is from? Yeah, somewhere around 2000, something like that. Maybe late 1999 or something like that. So the next big step on this part in the Postgres community was the Toronto Anniversary Summit in 2006. Now the team is sort of, this many people showed up. And at this point you can say, well, that's maybe 1/10 of the people who were active at the time. But they're the kind of people showed up. Now this is obviously not just the core team, but these are all people, or most of these are people who are sort of heavily involved at some level. We've got a large contingency of the people from the Japanese Postgres user group that showed up, many developers from around the world. I actually, one of the funniest things, I ran into one of the original PL Java developers here for the first time, and one of the very few times I've ever met him, and he lives about a 30-minute drive from my house. I don't live in Toronto. But people came out. Right? And this was the start of the in-person gatherings around Postgres. And you know, at this point, everyone in the core team is paid to work on Postgres. Or with Postgres, but what's the difference? If we're considering it in this group of all contributors, all contributions are important, then actually working with Postgres and providing feedbacks around that is just as important as writing code. And everyone on the core team is now paid to work on Postgres. It took about 10 years to move from 0 to 100%. Other contributors throughout are in a similar situation. Right? Today, a much, much bigger portion of the Postgres community are simply employed to work on Postgres, one way or another. They're just paid by different entities. They're employed by different entities. And there is still a lot of unpaid work going on Postgres. There is still a lot of people who are doing Postgres things, who are contributing Postgres features or answering posts on the mailing lists because they think it's fun, because they learn from it. I mean, the reason I started working myself and building patches for Postgres was to learn. Because there was this great team out there, and when I sent in a patch, they'd tell me what I did wrong and explain to me how to fix it. So I learned a lot of things. So we still have a lot of those, but a very strong portion of it are now people who are paid to work on Postgres. And of course, we've seen a lot of growth in the local communities, because Postgres has always been about local. Given that we are decentralized and distributed, there is no, oh, you want to work on Postgres? That's perfect. Please relocate to San Francisco, where all the startups are, or you have to move to New York to work on these companies. No, you can stay wherever you are. And then you can build a local community there. You can build a local online community, or you can build a local offline community through user groups. Again, we have our geographical things that are US, EU, and Japan. We have German-speaking and French-speaking and Spanish-speaking, which ignore country borders and instead go for language borders, because it makes a lot of sense. If you don't speak English, you might want a community that speaks your own language. These are all things that work. And looking at this from the European side, the event side or the meetup sites in Europe actually started right here in Italy. Not in Bologna though, but over in Prato, which is not that far away. In 2007, for the very first PG Day that we had, at least I think it's the first one, I'm pretty sure that it is, who was there other than me? I'm very happy to say that I was there. Okay, so you can say it's a growing community because we had like 5 people here, including the guy who made it happen. And well, that was the group that came, and we're like 5 times that size now, so that's sort of reasonable, right? Now 2007, like to put that into a slight perspective, we just had released Postgres 8.2, which gave us things like the returning clause. You could say insert into with a returning. We could do warm standby databases by copying files. And we just got create index concurrently. Right? For a lot of us, we're like, some of you are going like, what? Didn't Postgres have that forever? It turns out we didn't. But that's where we were. And then even just 1 year later, we were back in Prato. The first one was the Italian Postgres Day. The next day, they had convinced the rest of us that this whole PG Day thing was a good idea. So we now made a joint Italian and European PG Day, where we had a team from all of Europe who managed the English language track, and the Italian team managed the conference itself. And as you can see, we're a slightly bigger group now. It's moving fast. This is still 10 years ago, right? And we had Postgres 8.3. We had hot updates and full text search. And we had XML. Yeah, that turned out maybe not to be quite as exciting as it sounded at the time, but you know, we still have it. And we had the ability to do read-only transactions without XID, which I just put in because it's one of those, when people read about that in the release note, they were like, hey, why do I care? But that was the precursor to being able to do hot standby, which people do care about very much still today. And then taking a jump, I mean, these are reasonably sized group, but if we jump a few more rooms, this is Vienna in 2015, when we crossed 350 people for a 3-day event. And the community, just keeps moving up. We had Postgres 9, which had replication. I mean, really today it feels like we've had streaming replication since like forever. These are unsupported versions of Postgres. Hot standby, yes. Do statements. PG upgrade. We could suddenly upgrade Postgres without the dump and reload, sometimes. And tell you the truth, back then, PG upgrade was really scary. It still is kind of scary, but not as scary as it was back then. And nobody really wanted to use it. But we kind of had to. And of course, I mean, moving up from that, this is from Lisbon last year. Biggest one so far in Europe. Well, you all remember what were in Postgres last year, right? We got improved partitioning. We got actual stored procedures, which is one of those funny things that people kept marketing Postgres since back in the .com days in the late 90s, saying you should use Postgres instead of MySQL because they have stored procedures. It turns out we didn't. We do now. We had stored functions, which are different. We have added JIT compilation. There's a lot of things that are happening. Postgres is accelerating, right? We're adding more people, we're adding more features, we're adding more of everything all the time. But of course, this comes with a bunch of challenging. Like, we want to keep growing, but how do we keep growing, and how do we keep growing without risking what we have? Like, particularly from the community side. I mean, risking the code, well, we can just fork, that's fine. But we have a lot of value in our community that we need to work with. Now, doing local growth is relatively easier, and we're seeing it, I think we're seeing an absolute explosion of this today. We have our user groups around Europe and around the world. We're getting more and more of them. We're trying to help them all up. And we're seeing more and more of these now growing to the point that they want to do like a full day event somewhere. It's like the number of one-day events around Europe this year is just getting ridiculous. It feels like there's one every week in a different country, in a different somewhere. We're seeing more and more, and I think we should see even more of that, which is what I call co-events. Which are where there is a big event somewhere for somebody else. Our Postgres Europe good example is there is the big FOSDEM conference in Brussels. Who's ever been to FOSDEM? A couple of you. So this is the big, massive open source and free software conference over a weekend in February in Brussels. And then Postgres runs on the day before, we run a PGDay. And this is a pattern that we've been seeing in more places. We run a PGDay in front of OSCON. There's a PGDay in front of FOSS Asia in Singapore. And that's a way to tap into new people, to bring people into the Postgres community who are not already here. It can be done next to a Python conference or next to a Java conference or something, just bringing more people in at the local level. And that is something where every one of you can help. And bringing people in at the local level and bringing people in also brings me to another topic that I think is worth mentioning because it helps us very much in our community growth at this point, which is the whole idea of a code of conduct. Right? Postgres does have a global community code of conduct at this point. It is a simple one. It really shouldn't offend anyone because I'm sure that none of you are doing anything that would have any sort of issues with it because there's nothing strange in it. But it's there. And our experience, we've had it for about a year now. Actually, it's less, we've had it, but it was enforced a bit later than that. And unfortunately, experience shows that we needed one. Right? I'm still a believer that Postgres is better off than many other communities in these regards, but we're not immune to the kind of problems that keep people out and that make people leave. And having these set of sort of standard, very simple rules makes it a lot easier to bring people in, bring new people in at the local levels. They show up at one of these events and they want to stay. And that's how we grow the community. Right? Now, of course, if we're doing something like a PGDay attached to a Python conference, then of course we follow their rules. But when we're dealing between ourselves, we follow our set of general guidelines of how we treat each other and how we work together. I would encourage all of those of you who haven't already to just read up on it. It's like a page. It's not very long. It's not very strange. I don't think you'll be surprised by anything in it, but take a look at it. It does help a lot with generic community growth. Then, of course, we have the whole idea of actual developer growth, which is harder. Because finding developers is not that hard. Finding developers who are really good, who are in it for the long term, and who happen to be good at exactly the kind of things that we need is a much smaller group. Right? There are many, many good developers out there. There are much fewer of them with experience of building database servers, because it's a very niche part of things. And we need more developers. We always need more developers. But what we really need are like reviewers, right? Who can take the code that others submit, review it, make it even better, and finish it off. And of course, the problem here is that people who are new and joining the community usually aren't very good reviewers, because you first have to learn about the code before you can review other people's code. So it's sort of a chicken and an egg problem, right? We have new people who are contributing, and existing people need to review their stuff and help them up to a level where they can start reviewing the next set of stuff. And this is hard. Right? We have actual problems here. We need more committers. But we need committers with long-term commitments. Like, it doesn't help us to appoint a committer who leaves after a year. Because it takes a lot of time to get these people in all the way through. And again, committer is more about maintenance, more about responsibility than the actual writing of the code. So these are sort of unsolved problems. And we need to do this while maintaining user representation is something that I believe. So in a lot of big commercial projects, you have the developers are sitting over here and they never talk to the users. Because then you have, sales and services and all these organizations, and then you have the users. Now, one of the things we have in Postgres is the developers sometimes are the users, or they work very closely with the user. So you get a very direct line of feedback between the people who are building things on top of your product and the people who are actually building your product. And we need to maintain that. What we've seen, which is both good and bad, is a lot of, you get prominent representative of users of Postgres who post a lot on the mailing list, lots of feedback, and then after a while they get hired by one of the Postgres companies to do Postgres development, but now we lose the connection to the developer, to the user. So it's like, it's a difficult thing. We've even seen people do that. They've been doing Postgres part-time they get hired by a Postgres company and they do less Postgres. because they're now working with their customers. These are very real problems that we haven't figured out how to solve. These are real problems that we're going to need your help to deal with. We need to deal with our commercial growth, right? Postgres today has massive commercial involvement, which it didn't used to do, right? It used to be hobbies. We're now seeing some of the very biggest companies in the world are doing Postgres. Some of them are using Postgres, but some of them are building, like Microsoft does Postgres now, Amazon does Postgres. These are massive companies with huge amounts of money. They're bigger than anything in the Postgres community by many orders of magnitude, right? And we want this. We want the larger commercial involvements. But we want to do it while keeping the community in control. And that's going to be a challenge. It is a challenge, right? We think we can do it, but it's not going to be easy. Because obviously, as a large commercial entity, your goal is to make money. And you can make more money if you control things. Even within the community, we see commercial, particularly like commercial entities, can gain a lot by taking over a community entity, taking over a user group, because that gives them free marketing, things like that. It's not a huge problem today, but we're seeing attempts. We hear it from different places where basically companies are, it's mostly at the user group level today, which is not that big of a problem, but it could become a bigger problem. Like, if we lose the community independence and this whole thing, then we lose a lot of the really good force behind getting Postgres to where it is today. I firmly believe the reason that Postgres is where it is today is that it is not driven by one big commercial entity. Now, the good thing is, as I say, yes, we have these massive companies who are getting involved, like the big cloud providers, the big multinational enterprises in other areas. But there is more than one of them, and that's good for all of us. If there was just one, then we would be in much more trouble. But there is many of them, and they're competing with each other. And we just need to get all of these to also work in the community way, which is we all compete on business. All of us smaller Postgres companies all compete fiercely in business, but in the community, we're all working to make Postgres better. So to grow the community, we need you, right? Growing the community in a good way, it's hard. But the community that does everything else together, we build Postgres together, that's also hard. So this is where you will come in as well, which is we need you to help us expand the Postgres community. We need more of you people to get involved. I mean, Italy is big. You have ITPug, but you can have local meetups in all your different cities. There's going to be a PG Day next year, I'm sure. There should be more of you helping out with that. Contribute, either by giving a talk or just volunteer to help out with the organization. Get on the mailing list and review a patch. It doesn't have to take you, like you don't have to do a 100-hour commitment. You can take something small, do something small, and just incrementally get involved. And we'll grow things in a controlled fashion. And we'll grow things together and maintaining the Postgres community. So with that, I say thank you for your attention. I will be around most of the day, so if you have any further questions later, just grab me at any point with any questions around the community or around anything related to Postgres, really. So thank you very much.